Hey everyone, this is Steven, and this is my technical demonstration of an Active Directory home lab running Active Directory via Oracle's VirtualBox and adding 1,000 users with PowerShell. So just to cover some quick fundamentals before I get started, Active Directory is a service for securing and managing access to your business's networks, servers, and applications. It ensures the right people get access to what they need. Active Directory Domain Services is the main service that holds all the networking information and decides who can access what. Domain controllers are special servers in a network that handle requests from users who want to log in. They're like the gatekeepers of a specific area in the network, the domain. They ensure only authorized users can access certain things in the network by checking your login credentials. Domain controllers are a function of Active Directory. Think of Active Directory as the database, while domain controllers are the gatekeepers to the database. So for our Active Directory home lab, I'm using Oracle's VirtualBox, which is what we'll run our virtual machines on. The domain controller virtual machine is using a Windows Server 2019 ISO, and the Windows client virtual machine is using a Windows 10 ISO. To help the software run smoothly on VirtualBox, I've installed the VirtualBox extension pack. The server virtual machine is running on 2 GB of RAM and 4 cores of CPU. For the shared clipboard and drag and drop options, I've chosen bidirectional to control things between my laptop and the VM. For the network settings, Adapter 1 is set to NAT, which connects to our home internet. Adapter 2 is dedicated to the internal network and is accordingly set to internal network. So just to give a high-level overview and visual of what we're going to do in this lab, we have a diagram. This environment is a basic Windows networking environment with Active Directory and with a few networking services. It provides an idea of what an office or school networking environment is like. The domain controller virtual machine is going to house Active Directory. We're going to give this virtual machine 2 network adapters or NICs. One is going to be used to connect to the outside internet, and the other one is going to be used to connect to the VirtualBox private network that the clients are going to connect to. We're going to assign IP addressing for the internal network, while the external network will automatically get IP addressing from my home network. After we have IP addressing set up, we will name the server, then we'll install Active Directory and create our domain. Then we're going to configure a NAT and routing so the clients on the private network can reach the internet through the domain controller. Next, we're going to set up a DHCP on the domain controller so when we create our Windows 10 machine, it can automatically get an IP address. The default password I'll be using for the entire lab is password1 with a capital P. The last thing we'll do on the domain controller before we create our client virtual machine is we're going to run a PowerShell script that will automatically create 1,000 users in Active Directory. After creating the users, we will open our Windows 10 client virtual machine that's connected to the private VirtualBox network. We're going to name the machine Client1 and join it to the domain, and then we're going to log into it with one of our domain accounts. We're going to start by setting up our IP addressing. So referencing our diagram, we have 2 NICs, one that connects to the internet via our home network, and the other is the internal one that's going to be used for our internal network. The one that connects to the internet will automatically get an IP address from my home router. For the internal one, we have to set up the IP address manually, so we'll go to our VM and we'll click the network icon on the bottom right, and then click network and click change adapter options. So we'll notice we have 2 of them here, and we have to figure out which one is which and name them appropriately because we have to use these later when we're setting up routing. So let's check out the one on the right by right-clicking on it and click Status, Then in the window that opens, select Details. And this looks like your proper home IP address. And this is the one that's connected to the internet. So I will rename this one. You can right click it and select Rename. We'll rename this to _internet_ so we can easily identify it. Then we'll look at the other one by right-clicking it and selecting Status. And in the window that opens, we'll click Details. And the number provided in the auto configuration IPv4 is there because the adapter was looking for a DHCP server to get an IP address and was unable to. So instead, this address was automatically assigned to it, and that's how we know that that's the internal network. We'll right-click on it and rename it to x_internal_x, making it distinct from the other one. To assign an IP address to it, we'll right-click on it and select Properties, and we'll change our IPv4 by double-clicking it, then click on Use the following IP address. If we look at our diagram, we're going to assign the internal NIC's IP address, which is 172.16.0.1, and enter in the subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. We will not use the default gateway because the domain controller itself is going to serve as the default gateway. For the preferred DNS server portion, when we install Active Directory, it automatically installs DNS. So this server will actually use itself as the DNS server. So we will enter in the loopback address, which is 127.0.0.1, which is our way of automatically pinging ourselves. Then click OK twice. So we have our IP addressing set up. We didn't have to do anything with the first one, which is for the internet, and the second one is for our internal network. The next thing we will do is rename this PC by right-clicking the Start menu and selecting System. Then click on Rename this PC and enter in the name DC for Domain Controller. Then click Next and press Restart Now. Then continue. So looking at our diagram, to give us an overview of what's going on so far, we've been able to create our virtual machine. We have our internet and internal NICs, and we've configured an IP address. Next, we're going to install Active Directory domain services and create a domain. Next, we're going to install Active Directory domain services, otherwise known as ADDS, and then we're going to create a domain. At our Server Manager dashboard, we'll click on the second option, which is Add Roles and Features. We'll click Next, Next again, and in Server Selection is where we pick the server that we want to install Active Domain Services. So we just select our one main server and click Next. And in the Server Roles section, we also select Active Directory Domain Services and click Add Features without accidentally choosing any of the other options. Then click Next, then Next again, and then click Install. So now that the role has been installed, we can close out. You'll notice in the right-hand corner, there is a yellow notification flag. Here, we'll need to do our post-deployment configuration. In other words, we installed the software for Active Directory domain services, but we didn't actually create the domain yet. So we'll click Promote this server to a domain controller. In the deployment configuration section, we'll click Add a new forest. It can normally be named anything you want, but for this demonstration, we'll enter in mydomain.com. Then click Next, and then enter our password, then click Next, then Next again. Wait for the phrase My Domain to populate, and then click Next, then Next, then Next, then Next again, and then click Install. Now that it's finished, it will indicate that we're about to be signed out and the computer will restart. After restarting, we'll log in with our built-in admin account, and you'll notice it says My Domain/administrator now, which we didn't have before. After logging in, and we're actually going to create our own dedicated domain admin account instead of using the built-in administrator account. So we can do that by clicking on Windows Start, clicking Windows Administrative Tools, and then clicking Active Directory Users and Computers, and wait for it to open. We'll click on our drop-down menu for mydomain.com, and then right-click and select New, and add a new organizational unit, which is like having a folder with an Active Directory where we can put our admin account into. We'll name it _admins and uncheck Protect Container from Accidental Deletion to make it easier to delete later. Now we'll right-click on the newly listed created admins and select New, and then select User. We'll enter in our personal first and last name, and in the user logon name section, we'll use a common naming convention of A-first initial and last name. So in my case, I'll enter A-SSAMPSON to indicate that it's an admin account for me, then click Next. All of these will be in lowercase. We'll enter in our password and uncheck User Must Change Password at Next Logon and check Password Never Expires, then click Next, and then click Finish. So we have an account now, but it's not an admin yet, even though we named it A-. So to make it an actual domain admin, we right-click it and go to Properties, and we'll click on the Member Of tab and click Add. Then type in Domain Admins in the Enter Object Names to Select field. Click Check Names to the right, and it should resolve. Then we click OK, then hit Apply, then OK. So now we have our own domain admin account. So to use this, let's go ahead and log out of the domain controller by right-clicking on the user icon and selecting Sign Out. Now, instead of logging into my domain administrator account, we're going to sign in to the other user, and we'll sign in with our domain admin account. So you'll sign in with your A- account credentials that you created earlier. This pulls our name from Active Directory and logs us in. The next thing we're going to do is install RAS and NAT, which is Remote Access Service and Network Address Translation, onto the domain controller. The purpose of this installation is to allow our Windows 10 client to be on the private virtual network and still access the internet through the domain controller. To do this, we once again click on number 2, Add Roles and Features in our Server Manager dashboard, and click Next, then Next again, and this is our server. We again click Next, and in the Server Roles section, we select Remote Access, then click Next, Next through Features, and in the Role Services section, we're going to click on and install Routing. Then click Add Features, and click Next. Then Next, 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 and Install. After it's installed, we click Close. Next, we'll click on Tools in the upper right area, and then click on Routing and Remote Access. In the open window, right-click on DC Local, which is currently red, and select Configure and Enable Routing and Remote Access, and click Next, and select NAT to allow internal clients to connect to the internet using one public IP address. Click Next, and if the network interfaces don't appear here, just redo the previous steps and they should appear. In my case, they appeared the first time. Select the one that we named Internet and click Next and then Finish. Once completed, DC Local should be green indicating it's configured properly. Our RAS and NAT are configured, so now once we have our Windows 10 clients set up, they should be able to get to the internet, assuming we set up DHCP for them, which we'll start next. We're going to set up a DHCP server on our domain controller. So the next thing we're going to do is set up a DHCP server on our domain controller with scope information. This will enable our Windows 10 clients to get an IP address that will let them get on the internet and browse even though they're on the private internal network, similar to an office or school environment. So to set up our DHCP, we'll go back to the dashboard and click number 2, Add Roles and Features, click Next, Next for Roles Based. In the server selection section, you'll notice our server's name has changed to dcmydomain.com. So we'll click Next, and then we're going to select DHCP Server and Add Features, and then click Next, 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 then Install. After our DHCP role is finished installing, we can close the progress window. Then we can go to Tools in the upper right and select DHCP, where we can set up our scope once the DHCP control panel opens. The whole purpose of DHCP is to allow client computers on the network to automatically get their IP addresses. On our diagram here, we defined the scope as providing the IP addresses in the range, this being 172.16.0, 100 to 200. So going back to the control panel, we can go to our DHCP server dropdown, and we'll notice both IPs are down and red. So we're going to right-click IPv4 and select New Scope. And for the purpose of this lab, we will name the scope after the IP range. So we'll enter in 172.16.0.100/200 and click Next. The start address is 172.16.0.100. The end will be 172.16.0.200 with a mask or length of 24, and the subnet mask is 255.255.255.0. Click Next, and for the Add Exclusions and Delay selection, we'll leave it blank and click Next. For the lease duration, we will set it for 8 days as it's inconsequential for this lab. Then click Next. For the Configure DHCP options, we'll select Yes, as we do want to configure these settings because we want the client to be able to get on the internet. For the Router Default Gateway section, it's telling us to add an IP address for a router used by clients. So if we look at our network diagram, we'll see that we configured NAT on the domain controller, which already has routing configured as well, so it forwards traffic from the clients to the internet. Because of this, the clients are going to use the internal NIC of the domain controller as their default gateway/router. So we will enter the domain controller's IP address of 172.16.0.1 and then hit the Add button to the right, then click Next. For the domain name and DNS server section, just to explain, when you install Active Directory on the domain controller, it automatically installs DNS. So due to that, we're going to use the domain controller as our DNS server, or we won't be able to join the domain. So we'll remove the one listed here and replace it with the IP address 172.16.0.1, then click Next. For the Win server section, we'll just click Next. For the Activate Scope section, we'll click Yes, and then Next, and then Finish. Right-click on the IPv4 and select Refresh. Then right-click on dcmydomain.com and select Authorize. Then right-click it again and select Refresh. Now IPv4 should be green and contains the scope folder in the drop-down menu. You'll notice there are no entries in the address leases folder because we haven't created our client computer yet. So our DNS is now set up. Due to an error I've experienced in the past with DHCP setup, I'm going to return to the DHCP panel and go to Server Options. in the IPv4 dropdown. I'm going to right-click it and select Configure Options. Ensure the router option is selected. Next, I will enter the domain controller's IP address of 172.16.0.1 and click Apply, then OK. Next, I will right-click on the domain, select All Tasks, and select Restart. And now the router and IP address are listed, which completes the DHCP setup. Next, we will run a PowerShell script to create a list of users in Active Directory, so we'll have a selection of sample users and won't have to manually create them. To access the internet on the domain controller, which we normally wouldn't do in a production environment, as a way to get the link for the PowerShell file, we go to the dashboard screen and select 1 for Configure this location server, and disable IE Enhanced Security and Configuration option towards the right-hand side by clicking On. Turn off both options. For the PowerShell files, you can either access the file by downloading it via the web or copying to the desktop from your own computer, which is what I did using the bidirectional feature. So I'll open this folder that contains the names text file, which has 1,000 randomized names in it. At the very top, I'll add my own name in. We're going to use this file to create all of these users, then we'll save the file and close the document. Next, we'll click on the Windows Start button and go to Windows PowerShell, and we'll right-click on Windows PowerShell ISE, and then go to More and Run as Administrator, and click Yes and let this open. Then we'll go to Open Here and go to the desktop to our folder, and then we're going to open this Create Users PowerShell script, which we can zoom in on. Before we run or do anything, we have to enable the execution of all scripts on the server. So to get past the security features, I will type Set Execution Policy Unrestricted and press Enter. And when asked if we're sure, we will click Yes to all. So just to provide an explanation of this script, this password section shows what the password that our user accounts are going to use, and it will be the same for all of them. The Get Content Names text portion is taking all the names and copying and pasting them into the user first last list variable as an array. For the line password equals convert to secure string is taking our plain text user password, which is password1, and turns it into an object that PowerShell can use as a secure password. It will be used later on when we're creating the users in Active Directory. The new AD organizational unit name users line creates a new organizational unit with the name users and unchecks the box for protect containers from accidental deletion in the new OU dialog window. The for each section is essentially a loop that takes the user first last list and runs the block of code for each individual user in that list. The N represents the current user that is being examined. So in our list, my name is the first N, the second name is the second N, and the loop will run one time for each user. The username variable takes the first name and takes the first character of the first name and attaches it to the last name and changes it to lowercase. So in the case of my name, it would become lowercase SSAMPSON in lowercase. This ultimately becomes the username. The right host line will output the usernames in the color of cyan. The first equals N split space first element to lower means that N is the name and the first element, which is 0, or the first name is split by a space and is stored in the variable first. The next line for last splits element 1 or the last name and store in last. The new Add User section creates a new user in Active Directory, assigning the password, the first name, the last name, the username, checking the password never expires box. It names the OU users and enables the user account. Before we can run this, we have to go to the actual directory where the script is at to make it work to be able to actually pull in the names.txt directory. So we have to go directly to that directory. To do this, we type in cd for change directory, c:/users/a /desktop/ad folder, and these will autofill as you type them in, and press enter. If we type in ls and press enter, we can see the names.txt file in there. Now we will click the play button and select run once if prompted. It will now begin creating the users. You'll notice the usernames have the black background and cyan foreground colors as written in the right host line. Once completed, we can go into our Active Directory users and computers, right-click on mydomain.com, and select refresh to show the users folder if it hasn't already populated. We can search out any of the usernames by right-clicking on the domain and selecting find. With the users, contacts, and groups button selected, we can click find new. All the users will be in the field below. I can also search my first, initial, and last name, and it should find my admin account. If we look in our users folder, we should see all of our users. So now that our domain is set up with all of our users, we just need to open our Windows 10 virtual machine that uses an internal NIC that should give its IP address from the DHCP server we configured, which we will verify. It will be the Windows 10 Pro 64-bit version of Windows 10. The Windows 10 client is named Client 1 in VirtualBox and uses 4 GB of RAM and has the shared clipboard and drag and drop set to bidirectional. It will use 4 cores of CPU, and we will use internal network for adapter 1 in the network settings. So when first getting into Windows, we want to open command prompt and type in ipconfig /renew to ensure our configuration is current and that the IP addressing is correct. We'll then type in ipconfig and press enter to confirm our configuration is working. We can also try pinging something on the internet. So for this example, we'll type ping www.google.com, and if it resolves, that tells us that our DNS server is working because we can successfully ping to the internet, which also indicates to us the entire infrastructure we built from the diagram is working. We have connectivity all the way to the default gateway, which is the domain controller, which is properly NATing and forwarding it out to the internet, and our ping can come back successfully as an echo replay. We can ping mydomain.com, which is our domain controller, and the ping responds. If we type in hostname in command prompt, it will show us the computer's current name. Next, we'll right-click this Windows Start menu, select System, and on the right-hand side of the screen, we'll select Rename this PC Advanced. Click the Change button next to rename this computer and name it Client 1. And in the Member Of section directly below, select Domain and enter in mydomain.com and click OK. It will prompt me to enter in a username and a password of an account with permission to join the domain. In this case, I'll use my domain admin credentials, which will prompt a restart. We'll go back to the domain controller and go to the DHCP panel and go to the scope and then to the address leases, where we can see our lease for our client computer. So when we created our client computer and joined it to the network, it automatically communicated with the DHCP server to request an address, and then the DHCP assigned it an address, and now we have our lease showing up here. Now we'll go to Active Directory User and Computers and into the mydomain.com dropdown and select Computers, and we'll see our Client 1 computer, which tells us it's a member of the domain. With this computer being part of the domain, we can use any of the user accounts to log in. So returning to the Windows 10 client computer, at the login screen, we can log into the Other Users section, which is a part of my domain, and we can use any username along with our password, which is password1. I will use the credentials for Mark Rash from our name list, so the username will be capital M, lowercase R-A-S-H, mrash, along with our password. We can again go to command prompt and type who am I and press Enter to see your username. This concludes our Active Directory Home Lab.